The atmosphere in the studio that evening was calm, almost disarmingly so. There wasn't the usual tension that often accompanies high-profile political debates. Instead, there was a quiet confidence between the two speakers, Jasmine Crockett, a sharp-minded congresswoman known for her precision and calm, and Senator JD Vance, a man recognized for his analytical reasoning and steady delivery. Both had come prepared, not to attack, but to engage. What happened next, however, would show just how powerful composure can be in a world that often rewards chaos. Asterisk, as the cameras rolled, JD Vance began with his usual conviction. He spoke about the state of the economy, government inefficiency, and the need for responsible spending. His tone was measured, his points organized, his words carrying the kind of weight that comes from confidence in data. He leaned forward occasionally, emphasizing key statistics, breaking down percentages and budget allocations. It was clear that he had done his homework, and he wanted viewers to know that logic was on his side. Asterisk, Jasmine Crockett listened quietly, pen in hand, jotting notes as he spoke. She didn't interrupt. She didn't sigh or roll her eyes, gestures that often define televised debates. Her calm presence created a different kind of energy, one that made viewers pay closer attention to her silence as much as her eventual response. When JD Vance finished his point, there was a brief pause. A lesser debater might have jumped in immediately, eager to rebut, but Crockett simply took a breath and began in a voice so controlled it almost disarmed him. Asterisk, Senator, she said, her tone even. I understand where you're coming from when you talk about efficiency, but I think sometimes, when we talk numbers, we forget that behind those numbers are people. You mentioned cutting programs, but what happens when those cuts mean a veteran can't get his medication, or a mother can't afford childcare? Asterisk, it wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. Her calm composure forced JD Vance to actually listen, not just wait for his turn to speak. He nodded slightly, as if acknowledging her point, but then returned with his own. That the nation had to make hard choices to protect future generations from overwhelming debt. His delivery remained professional, and in another setting, his argument might have dominated. But Crockett's poise gave her the upper hand in a subtle, undeniable way. Asterisk, when JD Vance countered, she didn't react defensively. She let him finish each thought completely before addressing it directly, using the same steady rhythm. You're right that we have to think long-term, she replied, but cutting from the bottom doesn't solve the problem. It just shifts the burden to those who already carry the heaviest load. Asterisk, there were no raised voices, no interruptions, and no theatrics. Yet, the room felt charged. The controlling Crockett's tone made her words land more powerfully than if she had shouted. She didn't try to dominate the space. She owned it through composure. Even JD Vance, who is known for his strong debating skills, seemed to recognize it. He adjusted his posture, softened his delivery, and responded more thoughtfully than he had earlier in the exchange. Asterisk, viewers watching from home could sense it too. Social media lit up not because of an explosive moment, but because of the rare sight of two politicians maintaining civility. Crockett's composure became the focal point. Many remarked that her calm made JD Vance look less like an opponent and more like a partner in an important national conversation. That shift in tone changed the way people perceived the debate entirely. Asterisk, JD Vance's professionalism deserves credit. He didn't fall into the trap of escalation. In fact, his decision to stay level-headed in response to her poise showed a mutual respect that audiences admired. But it was Jasmine Crockett's unwavering calm that subtly tipped the balance. She showed that destruction in debate doesn't always come from volume or force. Sometimes, it comes from clarity, patience, and control. Asterisk, as the segment continued, both of them navigated complex questions with restraint, but Crockett's quiet authority anchored the discussion. She never lost her composure, even when JD Vance pressed her on fiscal inconsistencies or challenged her party's policies. Her responses stayed grounded, her tone even, and in the world of live television, where every pause and expression is magnified, that calmness spoke louder than any argument could. Asterisk, when the cameras finally stopped, it wasn't the words that stayed with people, but the atmosphere she created. JD Vance, though articulate and confident, had met an opponent who understood that poise is a kind of strength few can replicate. It was a reminder that in politics, as in life, composure often wins the moment, and sometimes, the message. Asterisk. Jasmine Crockett has always believed that numbers alone can't capture the full weight of policy decisions. During her live exchange with Senator JD Vance, that belief became the heart of her argument, and the reason so many people later said she connected in a way few politicians do. While JD Vance approached the discussion from a structural, economic point of view, Crockett leaned into something more human. Her words didn't just speak to the policy, they spoke to the people living within it. Asterisk, the conversation began with JD Vance, outlining his stance on government spending and the need for fiscal restraint. His delivery was clear and methodical, and he spoke in terms of budgets, percentages, and efficiency. If we don't control spending now, he said, we risk leaving our children with a national debt they'll never be able to pay off. It was a statement grounded in logic, one that resonated with viewers who valued financial responsibility. Crockett nodded as he spoke, not dismissing his points, but clearly preparing to approach the issue from a different angle. Asterisk when it was her turn. She began not with data but with a story. Last month, she said quietly, I met a single mother in my district who works 2 jobs just to pay for childcare. She's not asking for a handout. She's asking for a fair shot. Her tone was steady, but it carried weight. When we talk about cutting programs, we're not just moving numbers on a spreadsheet, Senator. We're deciding who gets to stay afloat and who doesn't. Asterisk JD Vance listened carefully, perhaps aware that the ground of the conversation had shifted. He responded with facts about how unchecked spending can harm those very same families in the long run, pointing to inflation and unsustainable deficits. If we don't act now, he said, those same families will face even greater hardship when the economy can't sustain itself. His reasoning was sound, the kind of argument that might win in a financial committee meeting. But Crockett's approach wasn't about winning an argument. It was about reminding everyone why the argument mattered in the first place. Asterisk she nodded again, acknowledging his point before adding, I agree that we need to be responsible, but responsibility doesn't mean ignoring the real-world effects of our choices. You talk about future generations, and that's important, but we can't forget the people struggling today. Her words were simple, yet they carried a truth that data alone couldn't express. Asterisk. What made this moment so compelling was the way she blended empathy with evidence. Crockett didn't dismiss the importance of budgets or economic forecasts. She reframed them within a moral context. She spoke about veterans waiting months for benefits, children going hungry in communities where school meal programs were underfunded, and small businesses barely surviving despite doing everything right. Each story she shared gave her argument emotional clarity, something statistics rarely achieve on their own. Asterisk JD Vance, to his credit, didn't shy away from her points. He countered by saying, empathy is vital, but we can't let emotion dictate policy. If we let spending spiral out of control, those same programs you care about won't exist in 10 years. It was a fair point, but Crockett met it with quiet conviction. Emotion doesn't dictate policy, she replied. Human experience informs it. There's a difference. Asterisk, that single line caught people's attention. It was the kind of statement that transcended party lines. JD Vance looked at her for a moment before replying, and though he stood by his position, the tone of the exchange had shifted from opposition to reflection. The two weren't just sparring anymore, they were participating in something deeper, an exploration of how empathy and economics intersect. Asterisk viewers noticed that while JD Vance spoke to the head, Crockett spoke to the heart without sacrificing logic. It wasn't about sentimentality, it was about context. Her use of real stories grounded the conversation, giving life to concepts that might otherwise feel distant or abstract. Instead of letting the debate spiral into talking points, she kept pulling it back to reality, the kind of reality that most Americans live in every day. Asterisk by the middle of the interview, even JD Vance began referencing some of her examples, acknowledging the challenges she described before returning to his fiscal framework. It was a subtle sign of respect, and it showed that he understood the power of the narrative she was building. He remained committed to his economic perspective, but the conversation became richer for it, less about who was right, and more about how both sides could understand the full picture. Asterisk, Crockett's use of real stories didn't just make her relate, it made her arguments memorable. People don't often recall exact figures or policy language, but they remember human faces, struggles, and triumphs. That night, her stories gave the numbers a heartbeat. And while JD Vance maintained his composure and logic throughout, it was her ability to translate policy into lived experience that made the conversation resonate with millions watching at home. Asterisk. When the debate between Jasmine Crockett and JD Vance aired, what immediately caught viewers' attention wasn't the policy disagreements or the sound bites, it was the tone. Both politicians came from different ends of the ideological spectrum, but neither resorted to hostility or grandstanding. In a political era dominated by shouting matches and viral confrontations, their exchange felt refreshingly different. Respect, rather than rivalry, shaped the atmosphere from start to finish. Asterisk JD Vance began the conversation with his usual precision. His opening remarks focused on national spending priorities, border policies, and the challenges facing middle-class families. His delivery was composed, and even when he critiqued opposing viewpoints, his tone remained steady and measured. There was no mockery, no dismissive smirk, just a man presenting his argument as clearly as he could. Crockett, seated across from him, listened carefully, nodding occasionally, but never interrupting. Her patience set a tone that immediately stood out to those watching at home. Asterisk when it was her turn to respond. Crockett didn't seize the floor with aggression or a rehearsed punchline. Instead, she thanked him for laying out his position before beginning her own. Senator, I understand your concerns about government spending, she said calmly, but sometimes the question isn't whether we spend, it's how we spend donde who benefits when we do. Her voice was even, almost conversational, but the weight of her words drew attention. Asterisk JD Vance replied without defensiveness. I agree, he said, that accountability matters. but we can't ignore that unchecked programs create long-term problems. It was clear that neither of them wanted to simply win the argument. They were trying to explain their perspectives, not perform them. That distinction was what made the exchange stand out. Asterisk, throughout the conversation, both speakers demonstrated restraint that's rare in live political settings. Crockett, known for her passion and sharp questioning, was deliberate in her pacing. JD Vance, often praised for his composure, met her calm with equal steadiness. They debated issues that normally spark fiery exchanges: economic inequality, government overreach, and partisan gridlock, yet somehow managed to keep it grounded in mutual respect. Viewers noticed the online response wasn't about who destroyed whom, but about how the two carried themselves in an environment that usually rewards outrage. Asterisk, there was a moment, about halfway through, that perfectly illustrated this balance. JD Vance had made a point about cutting inefficient spending, using examples from federal programs that had ballooned over time. Crockett countered by pointing out the potential harm of those cuts, emphasizing the people who relied on such programs to survive. As she spoke, she cited stories from her district teachers buying their own classroom supplies, families skipping meals to afford healthcare. Her tone remained calm, her words deliberate. Asterisk, when she finished, JD Vance didn't immediately respond. He took a moment, nodded slightly, and said, "That's fair, Congresswoman. I think we both agree the goal is to make sure resources reach those who truly need them. The question is how we get there." That acknowledgement may have seemed small, but it carried tremendous weight. It showed that he wasn't simply waiting to rebut, he was listening. In that moment, the audience witnessed something rare: two public officials respecting each other's intelligence and intent, even while disagreeing. Asterisk, that simple act of respect transformed the tone of the entire discussion. Instead of spiraling into confrontation, the debate deepened. Crockett later mentioned that respect isn't the absence of disagreement, it's the willingness to engage without demeaning. JD Vance seemed to share that sentiment, matching her tone and maintaining professionalism even when pressed. The rhythm between them became less like a clash and more like a conversation, a back and forth, where ideas, not egos, took center stage. Asterisk, viewers online reacted strongly to this dynamic. Comment sections filled with praise for both participants. "This is how debates should look," one viewer wrote. "No yelling, no interruptions, just real discussion." Others highlighted how refreshing it was to see two politicians model civility. Even those who disagreed with Crockett's positions admired her calm persistence, and those who supported JD Vance appreciated his willingness to stay grounded rather than combative. Asterisk, what made their exchange resonate wasn't just what was said, it was how it was said. In a culture where confrontation gets more attention than conversation, both Crockett and Vance reminded people that disagreement doesn't have to mean disrespect. Their discussion proved that ideas can collide without turning into personal attacks. When Crockett challenged his policy details, JD Vance didn't deflect. When he pushed back on her proposals, she didn't take offense. The tone remained constructive, almost reminiscent of an older era of politics, when debate was about persuasion rather than spectacle. Asterisk, by the time the cameras stopped rolling, viewers had witnessed something unexpectedly powerful. Neither had compromised their beliefs, but both had shown that conviction and courtesy can coexist. JD Vance's composure matched Jasmine Crockett's clarity, and together they modeled the kind of discourse that many feel has been missing from public life for far too long. In today's fast-paced world, where headlines often focus on heated exchanges and viral clashes, the debate between Jasmine Crockett and JD Vance stood out for an entirely different reason. The internet erupted not because of a scandal or a dramatic confrontation, but because of substance. Viewers found themselves replaying moments from the discussion, not to laugh or argue, but to think. The power of that exchange came from authenticity, something both politicians managed to display. Even as they stood firmly on opposite sides of the aisle, asterisk, JD Vance entered the conversation with his trademark confidence. He spoke carefully, every word chosen to reflect structure and logic. His arguments about fiscal policy and national priorities were coherent and grounded in numbers. Vance had always prided himself on being a voice of pragmatism in a chaotic political landscape, and that night was no different. His demeanor was calm, his facts organized, and his tone respectful. He wasn't trying to create viral clips. He was trying to make a case. But what neither he nor the audience expected was that the moment to go viral would come precisely because of the lack of theatrics. Asterisk, Jasmine Crockett, seated across from him, listened intently. Her body language conveyed focus rather than impatience. When she finally responded, she didn't go for the jugular. Instead, she began with an acknowledgement. "Senator Vance, I understand the importance of fiscal responsibility, but what I think we sometimes miss is the human cost of our efficiency." It was a soft start, but her voice carried conviction. Then, she began weaving together real stories. Constituents who'd written to her, families who had lost stability when policies shifted, veterans navigating endless bureaucracy. Each story was grounded in reality. each one humanizing a policy debate that could have easily stayed abstract. JD Vance didn't interrupt. He waited, listened, and then replied in his characteristically thoughtful tone. "I appreciate that perspective," he said, "and I think we share the same goal, helping families. But we can't help them if the programs that support them collapse under debt." It was a fair argument, one that reflected his background in economic policy. But what happened next turned the discussion into something far more memorable. Crockett looked at him and simply said, "Then maybe the question isn't whether we can afford to help, it's whether we can afford not to." The studio fell silent for a beat. There was no applause, no shouting, no exaggerated reaction, just a pause that let her words sink in. Even JD Vance took a second before replying, a small smile crossing his face as he nodded slightly. "That's a fair point," he admitted, and it was that mutual acknowledgement, that rare moment of civility and reflection, that captured viewers' attention long after the broadcast ended. Clips of the exchange spread across social media almost instantly. But instead of the usual flurry of insults or one-sided commentary, people were sharing it with comments like, "Finally, a real conversation, and this is what politics should look like." The debate went viral not because of division, but because it reminded people of what public discourse could be when honesty and respect guided. JD Vance himself gained quiet praise from unexpected corners for his willingness to listen, for not turning defensive when challenged. Crockett, on the other hand, was celebrated for the sincerity of her approach, not for overpowering him, but for connecting the dots between policy and people. Together, they created something unusual in modern politics, a viral moment defined by empathy, not outrage. The internet's response was proof that audiences are hungrier for substance than cynics believe. Viewers didn't just see a debate, they saw two people holding themselves accountable to the truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable. For every clip that showed Crockett making a strong point, there was another showing JD Vance responding thoughtfully, not dismissing, not attacking, but considering. It was rare, almost disarming, and people noticed. As the days went on, analysts and journalists praised the discussion for elevating the standard of political conversation. Commentators pointed out that Crockett's quiet confidence complemented Vance's logical reasoning, creating balance rather than chaos. One editorial even called it the debate that reminded America how to listen again. Both participants came out of it with more respect from viewers, Crockett for her empathy and authenticity, Vance for his discipline and composure. In a landscape where sensationalism usually drives attention, this debate became a quiet revolution. Substance went viral. Authentic dialogue outperformed outrage. And for once, people weren't sharing a clip to argue, they were sharing it to remember what thoughtful disagreement looked like. Both JD Vance and Jasmine Crockett showed that when leaders speak with integrity instead of arrogance, the public listens. The internet didn't explode because of insult or spectacle. It erupted because, for a brief moment, it saw something real. When the lights dimmed and the broadcast ended, something remarkable lingered in the air, not the echo of heated words, or the residue of political rivalry, but a quiet sense of respect. The debate between Jasmine Crockett and JD Vance had achieved what so many others failed to do. It reminded people that politics could still be human. Viewers didn't walk away exhausted or divided. They walked away thinking, in an age where outrage often overshadows reason, this exchange became proof that composure, empathy, and honesty could still capture the public's attention more powerfully than any spectacle ever could. For Jasmine Crockett, the night was more than just a successful debate performance. It was a defining moment. Her calm approach, rooted in compassion and understanding, showed that leadership doesn't always have to roar. Sometimes, it can whisper and still be heard. Her stories gave meaning to the numbers, her tone carried credibility, and her restraint reflected strength. She didn't set out to embarrass her opponent or dominate the stage. She came to be understood, and she succeeded. In doing so, she earned the respect of millions who saw her not just as a politician, but as a listener, a voice for those often unheard. JD Vance, too, walked away with newfound respect. His professionalism throughout the discussion stood as a testament to his discipline and thoughtfulness. He didn't let pride dictate his reactions, nor did he treat the exchange as a competition to be won. Instead, he treated it as a dialogue, one that demanded not just intellect but humility. His willingness to listen, to acknowledge fair points, even when they came from across the aisle, reflected a maturity that audiences appreciated. Many viewers noted that his calm engagement with Crockett elevated both of them. It was politics stripped of theater, replaced with civility and substance. As clips of the exchange continued to circulate, people began to reflect on why it resonated so deeply. It wasn't the words alone. It was the tone, the timing, the mutual acknowledgement that leadership means more than scoring points. The conversation became a rare reminder that opposing sides can disagree passionately, while still respecting each other's humanity. That lesson struck a chord far beyond the political sphere. Teachers used it in classrooms, journalists praised it as a model for discourse, and everyday viewers called it a breath of fresh air in a tired world. In the end, The night didn't belong to one person. It belonged to the idea that progress doesn't come from shouting the loudest, but from speaking with purpose. Both Jasmine Crockett and JD Vance showed that strength and empathy are not opposites. They are partners in understanding. The internet may have erupted with reactions, but beneath all the noise was something quieter and more profound: hope. Hope that respect still has a place in politics, that dialogue can still triumph over division, and that authenticity, when shown with sincerity, will always resonate far beyond the debates.